So I'm assuming that everyone is up to speed on all the old material. If that's not the case, we're going to do a very quick review, but we're not going to do, I'm not going to start from the beginning again, because if I do that, we'll be here all night. And so this is new material. Also, I'm going to ask everyone to be a little patient. I'm going to do the hard, troublesome math type stuff first, and then get into the stuff that's easy to understand and new material later, so bear with it for a little while. But I do think it's worth updating what we've done before and writing some of the intermediate things, and then the new material. The title of the talk tonight is A Matrix of Meaning for Sacred Alphabets. And although I'm only going to be dealing with the Hebrew alphabet, what I'm saying appears to be true by and large for the Arabic and the Greek alphabet, and in some related ways we think with some of the Eastern traditions as well, Tibetan perhaps. But I haven't done that work. So I'm going to use the Hebrew, and we know that the Greek alphabet is related to the Hebrew, and we know that the Arabic alphabet is related to the Hebrew. They both have the same numerological connection. A is 1, alpha is 1. I don't know what the Arabic name is, but the A letter is always 1, and they all have the same numerical value. And you can parallel these alphabets. And they also have the same equivalent with English, except in English we only have 26 letters, and in Hebrew there are 27 in the full alphabet. And the letter that's missing is near the middle of the alphabet, and it's the one that I use an English dollar sign for. It doesn't have anything to do with a dollar sign. So I think the thing to do is for me to try to follow my outline, which is very difficult for me to do. And if we do that, then we should be able to accomplish what I hope we can accomplish tonight. So thank you all for coming. This work is done under the auspices of the Meru Foundation, which is a non-profit foundation. Some of the other people here can help you with information about what we're doing if you're curious. And there are videotapes of the old material and the update material, and we're making a new tape now for the new material. So if anyone wants to get caught up, there are tapes available here, and they're also at Cody's on Telegraph Ave. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to rediscover the obvious. If it isn't going to turn out to be obvious when we're done, then it probably wasn't right. And so this is going to be a rediscovery of what it's hard to believe isn't known. I certainly find it hard to believe that some of these ideas are not known, at least the bottom line ideas we'll get to at the end. We're going to be talking about how we generate letters of the alphabet, and we're going to be talking about the meaning of sacred alphabets and their relationship to both the physical world and to the spiritual world. And that's the primary model, the relationship of the two parts of reality. We exist in an external reality, physical reality, and we have an internal reality, our consciousness. Inside is our consciousness, outside is the physical world. And that relationship between inside and outside is the basis for this whole presentation. In fact, that's the first letter of the text of Genesis, is the letter B. And the letter B stands for the distinction between inside and outside. It means a house, and we'll get into some of that as we go on. We're going to talk about not only some of these forms, which many of you have seen over the years, but now finally I'm going to try to identify some of these forms a little better. We've gone through in the past what happened when we attempted to look at the beginning of Genesis in Hebrew. And what we found is, I didn't bring the large posters for that, but this pyramid-shaped object, as you can see, has letters that are all paired up. Some of the letters aren't the same, and we'll talk about that too. These are the letters of the Hebrew text of Genesis, the first verse. And all that's happened here is we've taken the first verse, which should be up on the wall, and this you've seen from before. We recognize it as the first natural unit of the text, and we took Carlos Suarez and other Kabbalists' opinion literally. The teaching is that the secret of the whole universe, of everything we could ever know, is in the first letter of the sacred text. But if you can't figure it out from the first letter, it's repeated in greater detail in the first word. If you can't figure it out from the first word, it's repeated in greater detail in the first verse, in the first day, in the first week, etc. A description of a hierarchical system. Well, obviously, when I started this, it wasn't too easy to figure out the secret from the first letter. But now it becomes clear why the first letter has to be B. And that B stands for a container, for a box, for a house. The distinction between inside and outside. And then what we did with this sequence of Hebrew letters is we noticed these patterns, which I've talked about before, and I'm not going to get into. We noticed that the initial B and the final Z, I'll use the English names for the letters, they're equivalent, form a big aleph, a big A. And so that it's as if the head and tail of this snake that eats its tail comes back on itself. And as we've seen before, it forms this toroidal loop. In fact, that's what this pattern does. This little pyramid-shaped object, which is shaped this way for mathematical reasons, basically correlates the same letters with themselves as you curl around the first verse. You think of sort of a bead chain, with each letter being on a bead, and you can curl the chain around so the same letters line up. That's all I've done here. This pattern is so strong that correlates the letters at the beginning of Genesis that you could uniquely replace a letter if it had been miscopied, which would have been a horrible tragedy, of course, from a religious point of view, by just reference to the other letters of the first verse. It's that deeply self-referential. It's that deeply autocorrelated. It's that strong a pattern. But it's important now for us to try to figure out what these patterns represent. And what we found before that they represented was a way of generating the Hebrew alphabet. And that's what the basis of the previous work has been. And so what we want to do now is expand on that and find out how that works and what else it implies. We're going to be talking about some mathematical objects besides Arthur Young's 7 cycle, the turn, the reflexive turn. We're also going to be talking about material that Buckminster Fuller mentions. We're going to be talking about the Penrose twister, we'll mention that. Some hyperdimensional objects, and some reasons for why we would want to be talking about so-called hyperdimensional objects. Okay. The most important idea to keep in mind is that everything that we're going to be doing here is going to be based on the lowest order, the simplest, the most direct representation we can have. That's the only one we can count on to be universal. If, as is claimed, these sacred alphabets, the Hebrew alphabet, is a universal language, a universal alphabet, then if a high order effect had been picked, it wouldn't be universal. It couldn't be intrinsic. It couldn't be rediscovered independently other places. But if we pick the most elegant situation, that's a unique situation. And that's the one that we're going to be looking for. And the highest ideal we're going to be looking at, what we think we're looking at here, in the terms of the Hebrew alphabet and in terms of the text of Genesis, is the single, most deeply self-embedded, most deeply reflexive, if you will, most deeply self-embedded system that is possible. Now, if I were to tell you that I had the truth with a big T, and it was in a religious context, you would sort of walk away saying, oh yeah, another guy knows the truth. But if I told you that I had a truth, and I talked about the digits in pi, then you wouldn't have a problem with that. Everyone knows that pi is a fundamental truth of this reality, the relationship of the radius to the circumference of a circle. This is a fundamental of our reality. That's why we're going for the most deeply self-embedded, the most deeply reflexive system, a representation of that. Because if we go for that extreme, then we can have truth with a big T without getting into theological discussions, which really don't belong here, I don't think. And the primary form that we're going to be looking for, which I'm going to tell you about as we go along, is going to be this form. And I'll tell you its name ahead of time so that as we go through this, you'll get a sense of where I'm going with all this. I'm calling this form naked recursion. The idea is it's naked because it is unembellished. This is, I'm alleging, the lowest order way that you can represent the propensity of the universe to propagate itself. Raw, naked, unadorned recursion. And that applies to any system that recurs, such as a biological system. Acorn, oak tree, acorn, oak tree, acorn, oak tree, chicken, egg, the chicken put on the oak tree. But you get the idea. Any system that recurs is going to have this as a fundamental part of it. and then we're going to identify what this is. As you know from before, let's just do that so we don't make a big secret of it. This object, this entirely asymmetrical object, which in the past we've identified as a flame of consciousness. Hebrew letters are said to come from flame. Arabic letters are said to come from flame. Shadows of this object are all of these Hebrew letters. Same one object generates all of these letters of the alphabet. And I'll show you that when we get a little farther along. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because I do want to leave that towards the end. Okay. Let's review very quickly what we've done in the past. And I think I just said it. We found a pattern in the letters at the beginning of Genesis that when we expressed it in its most elegant form, produced this shape. In other words, this pattern...
You say that that's the core of the torch.
Yeah, you can actually see that. That, in fact, even though we're dealing here with a flat donut rather than a spherical donut, what this form really is nothing but the path of the 7-color map of the vortex on the donut in its lowest order form. Now this is not exactly the right shape for many reasons, but topologically it's the right shape. Geometrically it's not, and that's the second thing we want to deal with is determining the exact shape, which is what wasn't available a couple of years ago. So let's talk about that. If you make a donut, an ideal donut, mathematician's donut, this is the type you typically make. It falls through itself. It's got two circular cross sections. If you slice it this way, it's a circle, and if you slice it this way, it'll make two circles side by side. This is fine for mathematicians, but it doesn't tell us how to make the shape. For instance, if I simply took a spherical shaped donut, a dimpled sphere, which is going to be closer to what we want here, and I'll tell you why in a minute, I would have a form where the outside of the vortex came along horizontally, whereas on this form, as you can see if I compare it, it comes through vertically. Why? Okay. Let's do that first. What we're looking at, as a matter of fact, I think I want to read you a quote, I think. Yeah, let's do that first. Let's do that first. Except I don't have it in this book. I have it. This is a quote I've read before, and this is the key to the whole process. This is a discussion in the introduction to the Zohar, which is a Kabbalistic text. And I'll just read it to you, and then we'll talk about the key point. It's called The Lily. It says, students of Rabbi Shimon were assembled together and sitting in silence, waiting for the master to begin his discourse. At length, Rabbi Shimon spoke, and he said, as a lily among the thorns. And I've talked about that before. The lilies are all of these vortex shapes, all of the smooth shapes. In fact, you can see, if you look down into this, it looks sort of like a lily, like a cow lily. And the thorns are all a polyhedra, all, well, there's a thorn. It looks a little like a thorn. And when you put the two of them together, you're going to make the system. So continuing. This word lily, what does it mean and symbolize? He says it symbolizes the congregation of Israel, and the lily has 13 leaves surrounding it on all sides. And we've talked about that before. If you make a sphere out of spheres, there are 12 spheres around the central sphere. You could take the outer set of spheres to be the meat of a fruit, and the central sphere to be the seed. And we'll see why that happens in a second. For this reason, the lily symbolizes the cup of blessing. And he goes on and says, well, I'm going to just read it. As there are 5 words between the second and third Elohim mentioned in the book of Genesis, one of these words is or, meaning light. This light was treated, well, now we've got light. This light was treated and became enclosed as an embryo in the covenant. And entering into the lily as a principle of life made it fruitful. And this is what is called in Genesis, fruit tree, yielding fruit whose seed is in itself. And as this life principle, entering into the covenant, caused itself to become manifest in 42 kinds of second matter, so it has produced the 42-letter name of God, which operated in the creation of the world. If you would make another layer of spheres, there would be 42 spheres. And so we're identifying this figure. But the key phrase here is fruit tree yielding fruit whose seed is in itself. If we take that literally, we can unfurl the whole alphabet and all of its meaning. And that's one of the things that has happened recently. If you look at a fruit, here's an idealized fruit. It's a dimpled sphere. One could abstract it. There's a star of seeds in the middle. If you slice through an apple horizontally, you'll see a star of seeds in the middle, and two sort of elliptical cross sections. And one could put a 7-color map of vortex on that donut, on that dimpled sphere. And then we would have, here's again our fruit. But this is a fruit tree bearing fruit whose seed is in itself. So obviously in the center there's got to be a fruit. And between the seed and the fruit, there has to be the life cycle of the fruit tree. And that's the key to the understanding of what's being said here. From a seed to a tree, to a fruit with new seed inside, is one complete cycle of life. It's a recursive cycle, and it's a self-embedment. After all, the sphere in the middle, representing the seed pack, could itself be made up of 12 spheres and have a sphere in the middle of it. And one could go generation on generation from the seed through the tree to the fruit with the seed, plant that seed, grow a new tree, and one could have acorn and oak tree endlessly, infinitely long. And since we can't examine an infinite series because we don't last long enough to do it, we have to look at just one module of the series, one section. And that's the section from the seed through the tree to the fruit with the new seed inside. And that's a relationship between inside and outside, because we're going from inside where the seeds are to outside where the fruit is. If you look down on it, you see this little heart with a star in the middle of it. You can compare this fruit, by the way, which basically stretches itself generation after generation between the earth and the sun, to a spiritual situation where our hearts, because the fruit looks just like a heart, stretches between physical reality and spiritual reality. That we reach, we span in our lifetimes that same process. When we're born, we're all physical, and we don't have much developed consciousness. And when we age, our physicality starts to deteriorate, but hopefully we're building an embryo of consciousness inside. And so when we're finished with our life cycle, we're all spirit and we're very little matter. And then theoretically, the process restarts. And so this is the metaphor between a fruit tree and our own spiritual growth. That we are the tree now growing between our birth and our death. We are spanning between inside and outside on our chain of being. Okay. Now, just to tidy up, and this is in some of the material that's available. Grace at the door, I think, has some of the papers that show some of these things. What's going to determine the shape of this curve? Well, if we just had a point in there, if this seed model was a dead thing, just an idealized point, a mathematical point, a Cartesian point, we'd have very little. But a seed isn't an idealized point. The seed has life force in it somehow. And we need, if we're going to make a geometric model, we need to have some sort of a model for that life force. Well, in this model, it appears that the analog, the metaphor for the life force, is angular momentum. That it's because there is an intrinsic spin in the seed that the seed unfurls. And so one can look at this shape, and one can say that's the seed, and this is the stem erupting from the seed, and this is the unfurling of leaves and branches, and this is the fullness of the fruit. Comes to fruition. And so this is the whole life cycle from inside to outside, from the seed to the fruit. Now, if we're going to be modeling the life force by angular momentum, then we have to conserve angular momentum. And that's what determines the shape of the curve. You don't have to have a lot of physics to know what's going to happen. If you have a dancer, and the dancer is spinning, has angular momentum in them, they're spinning. They spin very quickly when their arms are in close, and they slow down when they put their arms out. Now, the Kabbalistic descriptions say that the arms of the universe go to infinity. If you could put your arms at infinity, then you would come to a stop. That's what's determining the shape of the curve. You see, here at the sprout, all the energy of the life force of the fruit, of the seed, I'm sorry, is erupting along the new stem, the new sprout. And there's not much width. Then at the top of the sprout, you get this little pair of leaves, and then you start to unfurl the rest of the plant, and it reaches its maximum unfurlment in any particular year, life cycle. And then it starts to bud and flower and make fruit, and eventually the flowers fall to the ground, and the seed is thrown to the wind and falls to the ground, and a new cycle starts. So what we're saying here is that all of this momentum has to be spent by the time you get to the fruit, because it's going to collapse that down again to that center point. So when you get to the outside, you're going to grow a new seed in the middle and transfer that momentum. Now, we know that a real fruit doesn't look like a donut. A real fruit is more closely approximated. This is the work of an artist named, I think it's Charles Adams in New York, who made this a number of years ago. He called it Genesis, by the way. A real fruit, if I can figure out where it opens, there it is, has these elliptical cross sections. It's a dimpled sphere. But nevertheless, the minimum way of representing the self-referential quality, the life-cycling quality, the seed out to fruit and then back to seed, is the 7-colored map that defines the surface of the donut. Just because it's a dimpled sphere doesn't change the topology in it. It's still going to have these same 7 sections. So we now have 3 criteria, which I'm saying should be able to determine this shape uniquely. 1, we have to be modeling a real fruit and not somebody's lunch, somebody's quick food lunch. We have to have a real snack, a real apple, a dimpled sphere. We have to conserve angular momentum because we're representing the life force. And it has to have this 7-color map, which can be minimally expressed in 3 turns for 1 turn through, or alternately 3 turns through for 1 turn around. This is the only 2 ways that one can minimally make the 7-color map. But again, we're going with Occam's razor here. We're going to try to go for the most elegant minimum state. Obviously, you can make all kinds of vortexes on all kinds of donuts, but the 2 ways that one can do it minimally are just these. 3 and 1 or 1 and 3 turns. 2 and 2 turns come apart. You don't make a donut. And 0 and 4 turns, there isn't any turns at all. So the only ways you can make the 7-color map are in these 2 forms.
Why do you divide the donut into 7 regions?
Because the topology that defines the surface of the donut says that there is a 7-color map. In other words, creating a 7-color map is equivalent to creating a donut. For instance, this, only a mathematician could get nutrition out of this donut. This is very flat and very square. But it has all the qualities of a donut. It connects its left to its right, its top to its bottom. After all, if you were going to make a donut, you would connect top to bottom and left and right, and this tube would come around and form a donut. And the topologists have proven that the minimum way to represent that surface is with this 7-color map. So that's something that you have to take as, for purposes of this discussion, as a given. It's topological truth. Also, as Arthur points out, the relationship between reflexive process and the surface of the donut, I suggest you read The Reflexive Universe for detailed discussion of that, probably better than I could do. Now, this is one new piece of information, because last year, the year before, we didn't know why this shape worked and this shape didn't work. And that leads us to a key idea. We are going to be taking topological forms that are minimal, but we're going to embody them geometrically in ways that represent living things. In other words, we're putting an additional constraint. If we didn't have a geometric constraint, we could use this form of donut. But because we're modeling a fruit tree...
Excuse me, Stan, will that show all the 7 touching one another?
Yes, yes.
Oh, that does?
It shows, in fact, I'll show you how good a metaphor for a living thing this is. If I had a stem here, and I push this down on the stem, watch the leaves unfurl along the stem. If this was drawn flat, those would be rectilinear regions. But you see the leaf-shaped sections coming out? It's as if I were pulling it down the stem, and it's literally unfurling these leaves, each colored region, and makes a golden mean spiral on the plant, the phyllotaxis of leaf unfurlment on a plant stem. So it's an exceedingly accurate model of embryonic growth. It really does, I'm going to show you some more parts of it as we go on. So that's this section, and this is covered on the videotape called The Coat of Many Colors, which we did as a supplement. There was another section that I wanted to cover that should clear up some confusion, and maybe people have been wondering about it. You may remember a number of years ago, I brought out this little Rubik cube, which has a Hebrew letter on each little cubie. And I realized that it was the symmetry of this cube, which has all 27 letters on it, because it's 3 by 3 by 3, so there's 27 cubies, 27 letters. They're in alphabetical order, layer by layer on a Cartesian coordinate system. You can review that. But I never knew, and what I found is a very strange thing. I didn't bring the same model, but if you look at the first verse of Genesis, you notice something very strange. You notice that there are letters that occur an even number of times in the first verse, and they're on the axis of symmetry. And you know, notice that letters occur, some letters occur, say this one occurs 1, 2, 3 times, and other letters occur 1 time. And I'm matching these letters up. What gave me the right to do that? They're not the same letters. What I found worked, but didn't know why it worked, was that the letters that are paired up in 3-to-1 proportion are on opposite sides of the cube. And so I have, if I hold this properly, here it is, I have an M opposite an E. Again, I'm using the English names. I have a T opposite an F. And those are the two that I'm showing over here. So it's the symmetry of the alphabet that enables us to correlate the text to find these patterns. Matter of fact, here is a text written in an alphabet that curls itself up into a form that casts shadows that are the letters that the text is written in. Fruit tree yielding fruit whose seed is in itself. That is very self-embedded. That is very self-referential. That's a very reflexive process. It's creating its own letters in which it's written. Again, this is a key idea. But where did this come from? Obviously, Dr. Rubik didn't exist at the time that Ezra put the Torah and the Bible back together again, about 500 BCE. This didn't exist, although there were maps like this that were used by the Greeks at around the time of the Septuagint translation, about 300 BCE. But there was no legitimacy to this. Well, it turns out that if one, instead of taking this donut, which makes this shape, which one gets the letters from, if one took this donut, which if one looks at the black lines, makes these 3 little loop-de-loops and fits the donut through it, then coming over here, look at what you get. Here's my 3 loops defining the surface of the donut with a 7-color map strung on it. And here are 3 loops also, which I've strung the alphabet on. You can just follow it around. Now, just as the first verse does, I've spliced the B and the final Z, the final tzadi at the end, together to form a big aleph. And then all the other letters are just arranged in alphabetical order on this very symmetrical form, which defines the donut. But when I do that, guess what? These concentric rings are exactly the same as the letters that are in opposite pairs on the Rubik cube. What a surprise. 4 layers, 4 trees of life, if you will, unfurling from a central point. Now, I know this doesn't really belong here, but it's kind of amusing, and I sort of have to do it. There's a wonderful new book written recently by famous physicist Stephen Hawking, where he starts off talking about the standard bane of all physics conferences on cosmology, where somebody in tennis shoes raises their hand and says, but the teachings are that a turtle holds up the world. And he makes fun of the fact that there's this ancient cosmology about how a tortoise holds up the world. The funny thing is, we're looking at the text of Genesis. We're looking at the alphabet said to be the alphabet of creation, the letters being elements of creation. And this word in the middle, tzadi beit, ZB, in Hebrew means tortoise. Not only that, but we're looking at a donut. And this is the donut. And that's a tortoise shell. You see the hex map that makes the 7-color map is the same as the pattern on the back of a tortoise. So maybe the ancients weren't so stupid. Maybe the guy that told the story didn't understand where it came from. But maybe if we went that far enough, there was an ancient worldview that knew something about the pattern of 6 around 1, the pattern on a donut. In fact, that's likely to be the case. Okay, let's leave that. There's one more catching up section that I want to show you, and this is a little more complicated. So let's get them out of the way one at a time. This one basically shows us that the symmetry that we use to correlate the text to make these patterns is also traditionally meaningful without resorting to Rubik cubes, and it's based on the same donut, except taking the donut in its other form. One form makes the letters, and the other form arranges the letters, and we'll see in more detail how that works later. Now, one of the criticisms of what I've been doing over the years has been all the Kabbalistic texts say you should use the 22-letter Hebrew alphabet, and I've been using a 27-letter Hebrew alphabet. Why in the world am I using these extra 5 letters? Well, in Hebrew, if you write a word and you use a letter, one of 5 letters, in the middle of the word, you draw it in one way. And if it happens to be at the end of a word, it has a final form. You draw it differently. And there are 5 letters that have final forms. And it's taught that they contain the secret of redemption, that they somehow redeem something. It's not clear what, but let's assume they redeem the alphabet, perhaps. And the question is, where do these 5 letters come from? Why should we have these 5 final letters? What do they have to do with anything? And how do they relate? How do the 22 and the 27 relate? Well, what we discovered is that if one looks at a 1/3 unit module of Buckminster Fuller's model of the tetrahelix, DNA double helix, there are exactly 22 faces. Isn't that nice? Because that means we can fit the Hebrew letters on them. In fact, what I've done here is simply wrap the alphabet around the form, going in this order. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, etc., and wrapped it around this way. And then what I've done is peeled it off this way. So let's do that. Well, it's an interesting thing to try, and it's a long story as to why we did that. But here it is. This is here's my tetrahelix with the letters wrapped around it. I slit one of the edges and fold it flat, slice it up, and I make these 3 sections, and then I can read the alphabet off in a new order. A, F, G, L, M, Z, Q, B, C, H, J. It doesn't make any sense. All garbled. But when we put these 3 on the 3 loops of the first distinction in knot theory, the trifoliate, the trefoil knot. After all, the donut is the first distinction one can make in nothingness. You have a universe that's composed of transparent, homogeneous, isotropic cosmic jello, and you try to make a form that sustains in that jello. You just cut a balloon of jello out of a sea of jello, you got nothing, because it sinks back into the jello and you can't tell where the boundaries were. But if God goes, fiat lux, let there be light, and puffs into the jello starts to fall through itself and forms a toroidal vortex. Again, as Arthur points out, as Ilya Prigogine points out, that lowest order form that can self-sustain, that can be detected, that's made of the same material as this cosmic jello, is the donut, is the two-torus. So the donut shape is the first distinction in the cosmic goo, and the trefoil knot, the simple knot, this knot, is the lowest distinction in knot theory. It's the simplest way you can tie a thing so it stays tied. Same form. Well, if we then put our alphabet in this new order on this form, we discover some very interesting things. Mostly we discover that the letters that turn out to be the final letters, which are these letters M, Z, N, K, and P, turn out to be on the extremities of the form. In fact, they are what you would do. Let's say you wanted to make a hyperdimensional object, but we only have 3 dimensions. Normally what we do to make a hyperdimensional object, we put a little cube inside of a big cube to make a hypercube. If we could make a little donut to fit inside of our big donut, then it would be like extending it into the next reality, recurring it, having it go over, spill over to the next manifestation from one generation to the next. Well, that's what's going on. The three letters that are on the perimeter, K, M, and N, are on the ends of the loop, here, here, and here. The P is up here, and the Z is down here. Well, that's nice, because P means mouth, and Z means tree, more or less. We're going to get into that in more detail later. And so you start from your mouth to what you stand on, your uprightness, your tree, your body part, and around your perimeter, there are three. And so what we've done is basically make a little itty-bitty donut that sort of either sits outside or inside the original donut. And those become the final letters. And in fact, it's going to turn out that there was a direct relationship between the 22 and the 27. And we'll get to that as we go on a little further. Okay. Now, that pretty much catches us up on the old material. Wait, there's one more piece I want to do, I guess. Maybe I should do it. This is our 7-color map that makes the torus. And these are the 22 letters that form on the surface of this tetrahelix. But if I open it up this way, it also puts the letters on the surface of the donut. In fact, instead of having 7 colors making the donut, I have a sequence of 22 regions, 22 colors, if you will, that make up the donut. And they can self-embed each other. I can go make little donuts inside of big donuts, etc. So if a donut has 7 colors, a donut of donuts has 49 colors. And altogether, that's 50, and that's the Jubilee. And that's another unit of the system. It's a generation of generations, a life cycle of life cycles, if you will. Okay, now I want to leave the older material, and I want to go on to what we've been doing recently, which is the most exciting part, which is what I hope you guys came for, because this is what I really, this gets me a little shaky myself. It's too unbelievable. So use your own judgment. I want to read a couple of quotes now, just to give a little background and provide a little break, and then we're going to dig in some of the nitty-gritty here, I hope. Actually, it's going to start getting simpler after a while, so don't get spooked. Stay with me. First, I want to say something about these symbols that are all around us. These are symbols. These are models. And one of my favorite authors in this regard, although he doesn't know much about the Jewish end of the tradition, he knows a lot about the Greek and the classical, and there's a lot of parallels, is Keith Critchlow. He's got a little book, I don't know if I brought it, yes I did, a little book I picked up years ago, it's actually a pamphlet, probably from a paper he gave, called The Soul as Sphere and Androgyne, and I don't quite know why he calls it that anymore, but he says something about these sacred symbols. He says, this primordial movement in the sphere, sometimes called the emergence of time in space, which not only gives birth to our world of change and differentiation, but is expressed in traditional cosmologies as concentric effusions of consciousness, concentric spheres. Let me get to those. I find it a little bit. But is expressed in traditional cosmologies as concentric effusions of consciousness. True symbols, as distinct from mere signs, express these fundamental patterns in their own way. It's important to remember that symbols have a sacred function. This is why I'm reading the quotas for this definition. By sacred, in this instance, is meant knowledge that is essential to normal, orderly evolution through the physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual spheres to full integration. The function of symbols is to, quote-unquote, throw together or fuse experiences into significances directed toward a state of recollection. Then he goes on to say, the cosmologies of concentric spheres solve the perennial paradox of unity in diversity, or, quote, coming into being, unquote, within being. The envelopes of consciousness which veil the blinding light of reality require careful and controlled penetration with love, discipline, and determination. Yet simply and ultimately, the unique, unity, and union are one. Now, that's the same point as the Kabbalists are making. Fruit tree yielding fruit whose seed is in itself. The credo of Judaism, what Abraham is credited with discovering, is the unity of inside and outside. There is a 4-letter name and a 5-letter name for God. The 4-letter name is the transcendent point within. The 5-letter name is all there is, the panoply, the immanence of the universe. Many people over the centuries have had meditational experiences, have come upon that one point of light, that meditational and transcendental point within. And people for centuries have worshipped idols and gods of all kinds. And everyone knows, or at least most people in this room know, that if you do your affirmations, even if it's to a pagan golden calf or something, you're going to get what you want, because the process of affirmation causes manifestation. The key to this teaching, on which the Abrahamic faiths are based, on which the Brahmic faiths are based, is that these two manifestations of deity, of divinity, are identical, are unique. That's what Krishna was saying too. That the God within, the point, the meditational point, and the all there is, the panoply of nature in the physical world, the God of immanence, are one, are unity. Inside, outside, and the process of resolving them is also unity. So I put that on the table. Now, I want to also tell you something from a Jewish perspective about some of these ideas, and I'm going to read you 2 quotes from a translation of the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, one of the Kabbalistic texts by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who is no longer alive, but who was a great Kabbalist and a mathematician and such. And this book on Yetzirah was assembled after he died from his notes, so it's not the best of his work. It sort of covers everything. He says, with regard to the alphabet, something that's very interesting, and it pertains to what we're going to be doing here. He says, the letters are said to pertain to foundation. That's the yesod on the tree of life. Since it is only through the letters that wisdom and understanding can come together and be coupled. Wisdom and understanding, eh? One is inside and one is outside. As discussed earlier, wisdom is pure non-verbal thought. Understanding, on the other hand, can only be verbal, since if an idea cannot be expressed verbally, it cannot be understood. The only link between non-verbal wisdom and verbal understanding consists of the letters of the alphabet. And that's what the point of this discussion is going to be. Now, he's going to give us a clue to this much farther along in the book, and this is a little out of context. He's discussing the Mishnah, the chapter in Sefer Yetzirah, where they talk about the law of 3, 7, and 12, which is much confused. And he covers all the standard discussions. And then he has a curious thing to say. He says, the sequence 3, 7, 12 can be defined in a number of ways. One, which we have discussed earlier, involved the lines connecting the Sephirot, which is on the tree of life. On a more sophisticated level, this sequence can be represented by a triangle, a tetrahedron, and a hypertetrahedron. Now that's the model that we're going to be addressing here, because we're going to go from a low-dimensional state to a higher-dimensional state, and then collapse back to the low-dimensional state and start over. One of the most intriguing and interesting thing about Arthur's theory is that you only need 3.9999 dimensions to do everything in, because when you hit 4 dimensions, you're already back in the beginning. You really don't have to go above it as the physicists do. What you have to do is remember to self-embed at the right place. So if you start with a point, and you open up to a triangle, to a tetrahedron, by the time you get to a hypertetrahedron, you're back to the point again. And that's what this mathematics and some of the drawings up here are hopefully going to help us to see. Okay, continuing further. Let's examine this process a little more closely. Let's look at the process of this opening up from low dimension to high dimension and self-embedment again. There are several different ways we can understand that, and it's a little hard to know where to start, so I guess I have to start from what I found and work backwards to save time. There are 27 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. It's a strange number, 3 by 3 by 3. It turns out, this caught my attention when I first heard of it. I think it was Saul Paul Serac, our physicist friend, who some of you know, who first brought it to my attention, that there are two places where this number 27 shows up in physics, in group theory that underlies the physics that they're using now. And the two places are discussed in a paper by Coxeter, a famous mathematician, and they relate to this set of 27 lines, or 27 points. What Coxeter has been able to prove is that if you were to have a sphere in 4 dimensions, it would be defined by the 27 lines that are solutions to the general cubic equation, and that those 27 lines can be mapped identically, 1-to-1, onto 27 points in complex 3-dimensional space on the surface of a 5-dimensional sphere, whatever that means. What we're going to discover is you don't need all these dimensions to do it if you figure out what these dimensions are about, and that's the key. See, we're looking at a system that unfurls. Seed, fruit, new seed, fruit, layer on layer, acorn, oak tree, unfurling from the beginning of time, all the way. And so our system is concentric. This is what I was saying before when I was reading the earlier quote about the idea of concentric effusions of consciousness. The idea, we've all seen it in the Kabbalistic and the mystical text, of these concentric shells that they draw, like an onion, they say the world is like. Concentric shells. Well, if we've got a concentric system, then we can do some tricks. We can reduce a higher dimensional system to a lower dimensional system without losing any of the symmetry. If we reduce it along the radius, we collapse concentrically. Everything shrinks in or out, and so the symmetries stay the same. Well, let's do it and see what happens. Let's find out what happens. What I want to present is a new way of displaying imaginary reality, and I want to identify it. In high school, we were taught that one can have a complex plane. We can have an x-axis, and then we can have an y-axis perpendicular to it, an imaginary axis, perpendicular, right angles to the real. That's a convention. It doesn't have to be at right angles. Mathematicians like to draw it at right angles because that makes it simple for us to see that the two directions are independent or orthogonal. But what if we were to say that the imaginary is in our imagination, is inside, and that the real, is the world? And so instead of rotating 90 degrees to get between imaginary and real, let's say we were to go between inside and outside. But of course, if we were to simply make two coordinate systems and they were coincident with each other, then we wouldn't be able to tell anything. They'd be all blurred together. But we know in nature the relationship, the geometric relationship of inside to outside, because we know in nature, let's see if I've got it up here someplace, well, it's a little symbol, but you can see it. We know about the Nautilus shell. We know about the golden mean function. We know that as nature unfurls things in golden mean proportions. And the inside is 1 over the golden mean as big as the outside. And it continues to unfurl in golden mean proportion. So if we were to make a plane, instead of making an imaginary plane that has a real axis and an imaginary axis at right angles, what if we were to make the real and the imaginary direction the same, but make the imaginary direction shorter in scale, have it only be 6/10 as big, 1 over the golden mean? Then instead of getting rectangular squares as our surfaces in 3 dimensions, we would get, well actually these are not there because that's why they designed the paper, we would get golden mean rectangles as planes. The imaginary one being shortened and the real axis being lengthened. And if we were operating in 6-dimensional space, we would have an interpenetration of 3 of these golden mean planes. And there they are. And each one of these is an imaginary plane. One is an x and ix, y and iy, z and iz if you want. There are other ways one can arrange it. And what you end up with is, of course, a sphere, an icosahedral sphere. And if you were to look what you can do with it, you can literally put these vortex forms on both faces of the golden mean triangles, the golden mean rectangles, showing how they unfurl. And you end up having this icosahedron. representing complex three-dimensional coordinate system. And then this icosahedron is our equivalent of the five-dimensional sphere. And all we have to figure out then is how we can arrange 27 points evenly on this complex three-dimensional form. Well, figure it out. If you've got 27 points and they have to be evenly arrayed, why evenly? Because that's the whole point of the 27. They're evenly arrayed on the sphere. There are fundamental directions on this hyperdimensional, supposedly hyperdimensional sphere. It's not so hyperdimensional anymore because we can see it. If they're evenly arranged and there are 6 dimensions, then there must be 27 divided by 6 points in each dimension. Very simple. What other choice is there? But 27 doesn't divide by 6. You get 4.5 points per dimension. You can't have a half a point. Even if Descartes could slice his points in half, we can't cut our seed in half because the plant will die. There's no half points in this system. They're quantum. Quantum of action, actually, in Arthur's terms. So that means that the dimensions must be paired. That means we have to have 9 points in each of 3 planes, surfaces, rather than 4.5 points in each of 6 lines, 6 linear dimensions. Well, that sort of does the trick, because that tells us that the dimensions have to be paired into these planes, and that tells us that what we really have to have, let's see if I can find it, is on each of the planes we have to have this little vortex shape that's going to have 9 points on it, and we're going to have 3 of them that penetrate each other. And you've seen this from the previous lectures. This I'm calling a Shushan flower, which is what's described in the introduction to the Zohar. And what you can see it comes from is that these are 3 loops here. And what they really are nothing but these 3 loops, but curled up some more. So this is just a curled up version of this. And this form somehow has to have these 27 points arrayed on it. Well, that's exactly what we've done. You see, if you take the form and you put the Hebrew letters on it, this round Rubik cube is supposed to be this, but something I could write on. The Aleph, the Yud, and the Kuf, the central letters are actually in the middle, in that center point. Then you've got a uniform distribution of the 27 letters in a way that's completely analogous to the way the mathematicians have distributed the 27 points. Now, Consider shows this in 2 different ways. He shows an diagonal projection, which is 3 concentric sets of 9. Very hard to project these hyperdimensional objects. He shows a dodecagonal version, which is 2 rings of 12 and then 3 stacked up in the middle. And in discussion with Saul Paul Sirag and others, we've come to the conclusion that if you have these forms, they also define, in some very fundamental way, Roger Penrose's twister. Now, where do we get the twister from? Here we're dealing with these hyperspherical things, and here we've got this set of nested donuts. Well, again, it's Arthur that pointed out that a solid torus in 3 dimensions is equivalent in many ways to a sphere in 4 dimensions. And so what we've got here is a sphere, a hypersphere, except it doesn't have to be in hyperdimensions if we make 3 levels of donut. Why 3 levels? Because we've got to have an inside, an outside, and an in-between. Now we're getting someplace. Because now what we can do is we can come over here and we can look at the turn, the reflexive turn, which folks that are here tonight are probably familiar with. Now, I'm not saying these are the same categories. We're dealing with a topological situation here, and we can make any number of sets of categories. But I'm saying that whichever categories we use are going to be isomorphic to this set that Arthur has used. I just pulled this out of the appendix to Reflexive Universe, I believe. Yeah, out of appendix 1. And the whole beauty of this is that, just like on the donut, it's symmetrical. The in and the out parts are reciprocal. And every level is reciprocal, and we've got these 4 levels. In fact, I don't have it here, and I haven't worked it out in detail, but I think we can compare these 4 levels to the 4 letters of the 4-letter name of God. In fact, there's even one that repeats, you see, because this idea here, this middle one, which I'm calling action together, is actually part of this one, which I'm calling action within and action projection. And we're going to get that in a minute. So that, in fact, we could really do it with the 4-letter name very compactly. And we could use the 4-letter name to generate our fundamental tetrahedron, and our tetrahedron is going to open up into this hypertetrahedron. And in a sense, it is a hypertetrahedron. Now, not only that, but let's figure out another thing besides the twister, which we now know comes in 3 layers. The twister and the orbifold from superstring theory are not the same objects. They're not the same thing. But they partake of the same topology. And the fundamental object in superstring space is this twister form, which in complex 3 dimensions has 27 corners to it. Now, the low-order form looks very suspiciously like our alphabet generator. After all, it's a donut with a hole in the middle, a spin axis, and 3 singularities. And I think that you can see the similarity here. This is the hole, and these are the 3 singularities, and if it was in a hyperdimensional space, according to the mathematicians, there would be 27 of these singularities. And they would be in the same form, the same relationship as the 27 points in complex 3 dimensions, which is what they're saying there, or the 27 lines in 4 dimensions, which are intrinsic in the point itself. It's going to get easier, folks. Bear with me a little longer. I know this is going all over the place with numbers, and for the purposes of time, I really can't do all the details. It's more a matter of just showing it. Okay. So what are we to make of this, and what does this tell us? Well, it gives us a hint as to what's going on with the alphabet. Because if we make the presumption that the 27 letters and these 27 lines, or 27 points, are the same, then we should try to see if there's some underlying logic that holds the 2 in common. Well, we know the logic of the ideal mathematical forms. This is a very, very symmetrical 3 by 3 by 3 system in this hyperdimensional space. What if the alphabet were the same way? What would it look like? Well, it would have 3 levels to it. And that's what we find in the alphabet. And I think that's what we want to go to next. I want to check my notes and make sure I haven't skipped anything. Now, if we can back up and make a language out of all of this, and see if we can figure out what the issue is. Look, to make a language, a universal language, which is what we're trying to make, because that's what the religious traditions claim, that's what the sacred alphabet is supposed to be for. It has to be common to all consciousness. It has to be very elegant. And it has to do what language does. What does language do? What does language do? What does language do? Right. You point at something. You name something. You have to. If I were walking around and I pointed to this thing, and I wanted to tell you about this thing, I could call you into the room and I could point to that thing again. But if you weren't in the room and I didn't want to do that, I could make a drawing of it maybe. Or I could make a noise. How am I supposed to know what noise to make? Well, here's the theory. This is what we're going to go with. This is a non-linguistic theory. This is a non-drift theory. We're not referring to what the linguists are doing. This is a different level of understanding of language. When I take my arm, my hand, and I point at something, my hand does that pointing because there is a map on my motor cortex for my hand that tells my hand how to point. And that motor cortex map is not just a photograph of my hand in some particular position, it's a dynamic model. It tells my hand how to move. It's got at least a beginning and an end to it, and a middle too probably. And so that dynamic model can't be just a 3-dimensional model. It has to have dynamics in it. It has to have change in it. that is what a mathematician would call a hyperdimensional model. It would have to have some additional information. Well, if it's a hyperdimensional model, if our conceptual space on our motor cortex, which directs the motion of our hand, is hyperdimensional, say 4, 5, 6, or 7 dimensions, then this geometry holds. And the natural parts of that map, no matter how my neurons are wired, no matter what kind of brain I have, no matter what my biology is, if I am directing this kind of motion, I must be making use of these 27 directions in that map. That's the lowest way that I can specify the whole map. And therefore, on my motor cortex, there is some kind of a map laid out in these 27 directions. And let's say I want to make a sound that corresponds to my pointing. Well, what's the most obvious thing to do? Is that the sound? The most obvious thing to do is to co-opt the same map as I use to move my hand and slide it across my motor cortex for my hand to a region in my motor cortex for my hand that it serves another purpose. Language is controlled by a sub-region of the motor cortex for the hand. Broca's region and the other language control regions are there. And if I try to take this same map and just slide it across some kind of neuron transfer thing, and then use the same set of map, of coordinations, to articulate the muscles that make my sound rather than move my arm, I'm going to end up making a sound. But who knows if it's the right sound? I mean, there's no obvious hardwiring connection. This is a conceptual map. But I hear the sound I make. And that comes back into my sensory cortex through my ear. And I'm saying that the map on my motor cortex that moves my hand, and the map on my motor cortex that makes the sound, and the map on my sensory cortex that hears the sound, are all hyperdimensional maps. And the feedback loop that connects all of this is also a dynamic map. And all of these have 27 parts. Or the 22-part version. I don't want to get confused with it. In other words, it's back to what Critchlow is saying. The unique unity and union are one. All three cortex maps have to be the same for that sound to have meant what that hand did. And so what I'm saying may be the case is that these letters, as we're going to see, are not initially the letters of ordinary language, as the linguistic theorist would have you believe. Later they became that. They were co-opted for ordinary speech. But they are instead the natural pieces of the envelope of the reflexive process that any self-aware creature must use to form any language. That it is necessary in its lowest order that this projective process have these 27 pieces, that they have the same logical structure that Coxeter and the group theoretic physicists point out, and that's, no matter what we really do, we can always simplify what we've done to this 27 element system. It covers the whole gamut. Now, the only way to find out if this makes any sense is to try to use it. And so we're going to try to use it. But before we try to use it and go to this matrix of meaning for the letters of the alphabet, we have to somehow recognize what this generator for the letter shapes has to do with this map on our cortex. Well, what is this shape? I said at the beginning I was going to call it naked recursion. That's another fancy word for a kind of self-embedded reflexive structure. That basically every module of this self-referential process has to partake of this. And so what could this thing be? Well, if you had a sphere in 3 dimensions, it would have 3 diameters that would be perpendicular, right angles to each other, Cartesian cross. If you had a sphere in 4 dimensions, there would be an additional diameter perpendicular to the other 3, but we couldn't see it. It's the one that we correlate with dynamics, with change in 3 dimensions. It's the one that relates inside to outside. in 3 space. In fact, if you go into 4 dimensions, you can actually take right-handed things and convert them into left-handed things by rotating through hyperspace, theoretically. So it's this inside-out direction. This is the missing diameter of the hypersphere projected back into 3 dimensions. It doesn't have to be a hypersphere. What we're calling, the mathematicians are calling a 4-dimensional, a 3-sphere in 4 space, is really nothing but the dynamics of an ordinary sphere in 3 dimensions. And this form that connects the inside to the outside of a fruit, a dimpled sphere, an idealized fruit, this is that diameter. And so, if I can see all of these possible orientations, all of these letters, if they correlate to these 27 directions, then this alphabet gives me a way to point in hyperspace, or in conceptual space, to all the possibilities. Well, I just said it, to point. You see, this is a hand. This is not only the flame of consciousness, this is our model of inside projected outside. When I want to do something in the universe with my will, this is the instrument of my will in the world, is my hand. I could use my foot, I could use my nose, but I mostly use my hand. If I wanted to make an alphabet that would be equally good for the world of physics, the real world, and would be good for meditation. Why meditation? Well, let's step back again and say, what's this alphabet for? Let's say you find yourself off in the desert 3,000-4,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago, biblical times. And I fell off a camel. I hit myself in the head. I was wandering around. There was this funny mushroom next to the rock there, and I tasted it. I pricked my finger and got poisoned and had a terrible experience. I just didn't eat for a few days. I wandered in the desert for a long time. I ended up, one way or another, having a mystical experience, a transcendental experience. And it's an integrative experience. It's a healing experience. Modern psychotherapists report that when you have these peak experiences, these transcendental experiences, you come back a more integrated person. Your inside and your outside are more attuned with each other. But this is an ineffable experience. You can't describe it in words by definition. No matter how good you are, there isn't any language you could use to describe this. So how can you pass on this teaching, this ability, this experience? Well, obviously, if you fell off a camel and hit yourself in the head, it's not the way you want to reproduce the experiment. It's not really very reproducible. But if you have a means of re-experiencing this, a meditation, a sequence of exercises, breathing exercises, dancing, yoga, mudras and asanas, whatever it might be. Different traditions use different means, different people use different means. And if you could somehow specify the experience so someone else could retrace your path, then they would have the same experience. And so if somehow there were a means of specifying a meditation internally, that would be a much better way of reproducing the experience than simply writing down, I had this wonderful peak experience which I can't describe. Because then the next person who could retrace your path exactly would have supposedly an equivalent, a related experience. And so we want an alphabet that's going to work inside too. Not only does it tell us what direction to point in the world, but it also has to be visualizable in our mind's eye. Now that's what makes this so beautiful. There are 2 teachings about the source of the alphabet. One of them is that the letters come from fire or flame. And the other, in Hebrew, is that these letter shapes, and these are the formal shapes, all of them are made up of the letter Yud. This small little letter. They're all composed of little pieces of Yud. That's a nice teaching. And it's obviously true in terms of calligraphy. But Yud also means hand. And the one thing that every human being can automatically do, it's a survival necessity, is visualize their own hand. You close your eyes, Try it. Close your eyes and point towards the ceiling. Hold your hand any way you want. You will be able to see in your imagination, in your mind's eye, where your hand is, where your fingers are, where your palm is. And so, if you put the hand in your hand, you can feel it against your skin, you can immediately visualize the letters. What is more natural as a source of an alphabet than to take from the hand the letters in the same way as the speech is taken from the motor cortex for the hand in the brain? And how was it forgotten that the letters came from a hand? They wrote it down. It says it comes from yod. Except people thought it meant the small yod instead of the hand. So now we have the physical metaphor, the physical expression of outside of our inside, being used for the purpose of connecting outside and inside and outside. And this is the first important finding, is that what we're really looking at here, what's really going on, is that this naked recursion, this self-embedment, is our hand. This is how we express our inside in the outside world. This is our way of embedding ourselves in reality, is our hand. All right. Now, I think I want to go directly towards the most difficult and controversial part now of this presentation. And we'll come back with questions and comments to some of these other ideas, and I think there'll probably be lots of questions. Because what I want to do now is present something that's unbelievable. It's not that others haven't said it, it's that they haven't said it in a way that's credible. I certainly never believed it before. The claim that the Hebrew letters are the actual elements of creation and are natural elements and were originally a universal language, knowledge of which was lost at Babel, and things like that. Who would believe that? Many people have said it, of course. In fact, it's even been demonstrated to some extent. There is a computer program that you can buy based on the Arabic alphabet that translates between languages. It's called Readware by a company called MITI out of, I think, Washington, D.C. There's some local people there we've spoken to. They base their computer system on the second surah of the Quran, and they don't know why it works. So it does seem to work, but I think this is the underlying reason why it works. And what I want to do is I want to go through the alphabet letter by letter. Now, most of you should have alphabet charts. And what I want to do is use these, basically these charts and this chart here. And I think rather than my continuing to give you all this theory, I should put these definitions of the letters on the table and let you take them all home and try to use them. So let's see if we can do it. Here is fundamental process, fundamental self-organization. And I'm saying that this 7-step process is the tree, and that it connects between unity and wholeness, between the seed and the fruit, with new seed inside, between a point sphere and a sphere point. And it does it in just under 4-dimensional steps. Never quite makes it the 4th dimension, because as soon as you get up to wholeness, it's got a new seed inside, and the old fruit is eaten up by the chicken. I mixed a few metaphors there, but you know what I mean. The chick finishes all the white before it cracks the shell. All right, let's lay out the logic, and then let's apply it. First, we're going to start with unity, and we're going to end up with wholeness. And we're going to do that in 3 levels of the alphabet. And the first step beyond unity is the first distinction. The first distinction in what? The first distinction par excellence. Whether it's Spencer Brown's mark of distinction between inside and outside, whether it's a newborn child gasping for air and starting to breathe in and out, whether it's the child's consciousness coalescing around the first volitional act of taking of food in, whether it's the birth itself or the breaking the egg itself. The first distinction is between inside and outside. Breaking open. And then there's action. Then there's a relationship between the 2 parts, between inside and outside. Then there's continued opening, which I'm calling division here. Then there's action together, which is equivalent to the turn. Then there's multiplication, which is the opposite of division, in the same sense as Arthur says, takes on its own center and throws off centers. Here it takes on a center by repeated division, this detractus form. Here it throws off centers by multiplication and the golden mean unfurlment. And again, this is another kind of action. If this is internalized action, if this is action together, then this must be externalized action, projection. And then if this is opening, this must be closure. Now we're going to apply, and then after closure, we come back to wholeness. The fruit encloses itself, the egg shell is finished, and now we have wholeness. Now we're going to apply these principles to 3 levels of the alphabet, and we're going to examine how the meaning of the Hebrew letter corresponds to this chart. Now, I don't think people can read this unless they've got it in front of them, but I will go through it. Every Hebrew letter has a name, and those names have meaning. And many of the Hebrew letters have known explicit meaning as either prefixes or suffixes, which complement the meaning of the name. And so every Hebrew letter comes with a whole story. What we're going to find is that for every Hebrew letter name, there is an equivalent English word that has the same meaning. And it's going to be surprising enough. And then we're going to find that any word in any language that we can transliterate into Hebrew, we can translate on this chart, and we can find root word meanings by only referring to the chart. Now these aren't idiomatic meanings, these are operational meanings. Okay, here's Aleph. Aleph is spelled A-L-P in Hebrew. It's the high point, it's all consciousness, it's the whole thing. The English word is out, or aloof, or alive. Those all have the same roots, which allowing for a little phonetic drift. Now, if Aleph over here is all consciousness, the whole enchilada, the whole thing, the big unity, and if this first level of the alphabet is the archetypal level, then we should have a repetition of that meaning at the next level, which I'm calling the inside, the intermediate level, which is, as mentioned in the quotation, the level of wisdom. And then finally, at the third level of the alphabet, the final 9 letters, we're going to have the outside, the physical embodiment, as opposed to the spiritual, the physical, as opposed to the mental. This is going to be physical and material. We have another set of 9. So if this is all consciousness, then the Yud, the I, is obviously our personalized internal consciousness. Id, the English word, has the same spelling as the Hebrew word Yud. And the last letter, Kuf, in Hebrew, means a copy, or it means a monkey, or a skull. But the word Kuf is cognate to our word cap, or copy. It's a K instead of a C, but it's a hard C, so it's C-O-P, copy, cap, C-A-P. And so we have, and that's the monkey, that's the physical consciousness. This is our internal consciousness, the small consciousness, the little point, and this is the whole enchilada, big consciousness, the great light. These 3 together spell something in Hebrew. Q-I-A, kia, ki is the word in Hebrew for eruption or for vomiting. And that's what's going on at this central point. This is the point where the system erupts from. This is this central point in the middle, the influx, where the whole system erupts from. And of course it's cognate to the Eastern idea of the ki, the life force, the vital energy. C-H-I is the normal spelling. It's hard to get the pronunciation. So this is the first 3 letters. The next 3 are B, K, and R. B is as I said, the distinction between inside and outside, spelled in Hebrew B-Y-T. It's our word bit. This is obviously not a phonetic drift theory. The word bit didn't mean first distinction until we had computers. Or byte, B-Y-T-E. The Hebrew word bet traditionally means a house. That's the distinction between inside and outside. We would call that word in English booth. It's a little house. The the Hebrew letter bet is given the numerical value of 2, but the cognate word is both. If B is this distinction between inside and outside, then what's K? Well, that's the word kaf in Hebrew. Kaf in Hebrew means, as a prefix, like, as, or like. It's spelled, here it is, KP. It means a cup, or a hoof. And the reason it means like is because when you cup something, you get things that are like each other. Cupping is making something like. And in fact, if B is the distinction between inside and outside, cupping, also cup means the palm in Hebrew, holds in. And therefore, you're going to know what the resh is. Resh in Hebrew, word resh means head. It means point of that radiates out from. It means to rush. It means a ruse. And so this is the distinction between inside and outside. This is to hold in, and this is to radiate out. Next we have Gimel, Lamed, and Shin, C, L, and S in English. Gimel is spelled Gimel, Mem, Lamed, and we know in Hebrew that the Mem means from and the Lamed means to, and the Gimel is our letter C, and the word Gimel means a camel, and a camel goes back and forth in the desert between two oases. It comes and goes from and to. G, Gimel, Mem, Lamed. Come and go, Mem, from, Lamed, to. Camel goes back and forth. And that's why it's called the camel. Well, and I'm saying that that's the quantum of action. That's the action. That's a little photon, a little quantum related to light. If that's the idea of action, then Lamed has to be internal action. The word Lamed means to study, to learn, or to teach. The English word that I think comes closest is blooming or looming, spelled very similarly. And the S, Shin in Hebrew, which means a tooth, means luster. It can mean 3. It can mean a notch. That's the external light. That's the external action. The Hebrew spelling is S-H actually, pronunciation, but S-I-N. Well, the external luster is a sin, or the sun, or to shine, S-H-I-N-E. Same spelling phonetically as the Hebrew name, having the same meaning. Archetype of action, internal action, external action. Then we have D, M, and T. Well, D, we know the Greek word for D is delta. In Hebrew, it's dalet, but they mean the same. They mean to open up in a kind of dissipative way. The way a delta does when the river reaches the ocean, it spreads out, it divides from within, opens up, divides itself into the ocean, the water spread out. And so dalet in Hebrew, if we look at the chart, some of you have the charts, they're available, means a door, and it means to pour out. It can mean P-O-O-R or P-O-U-R. And the idea of a delta in Greek, I think, is the best way. The English word, of course, that corresponds would be dilate or dilute. Same sense. Dilate, to open out, to dilute. The river obviously dilutes itself as it enters the city. Well, what's mem? Well, mem, we all know mem. Mem in every language means mother or city. It's to divide from within, from the womb. To open out from inside, to divide. And mem, the word mem is we cognate to our word mam, or mom, or aum, or om. And there are probably others like that too. Let's look at the last one, the T. Well, the T in English is a cross form, an alternating form. T in Hebrew is, tav is the name, means a sign or a mark, means to engrave itself. It's reflexiveness itself. It's our word sub, to cut out, engrave out. It's tab, to cut a tab out of something. And so if the M is division internally, this propagation opening from within, the tug is this kind of alternation, reciprocation, self-action. And so I'm saying the letter T refers to the word itself. This one I always like. The E, the N, and the final K. The prefix he in Hebrew means the. The word he refers to a window. It's also the feminine singular ending very often, just like we have a silent E.
Speaking of window, I think we might open the window back there. I think it's getting a little stuck.
Okay. Someone want to open a window?
Yes, let's open this window.
It's open.
Hey, as you can see, has a double form to it. Okay? Well, let's see, from your direction, it looks like that. It's got a little one and a big one around it. It's the inside and the outside together. In and out. You see, the B is in or out, and the hey is in and out. And it means, designates, it means the. It's also a prefix referring to the name of God. And the idea of God being in and out together with the whole enchilada, the whole thing. What are enchiladas today? I don't know what enchiladas. Obviously, for folks watching the tape, this is being taped in California, so we have enchiladas. The N, if this is the idea of opening a window, a connection between in and out, well, we know what the letter N means in English. It's the letter that we always use when we connect something. In fact, N in Hebrew, the name of the letter is Nun, N-U-N usually in English, but it could be just as well spelled N-O-O-N, and the Nun connects the A-M and the P-M in the middle. The Nun is the neck, the nexus, that's N. The internal connector between the mind and the body. It's that kind of connector. And the K is a final version of the earlier K. It indicates possessiveness. It indicates external connection as a suffix. But look at these letters together. E, N, and K. Well, turn them around. N, E, K. That spells neck. B, K, and R, or B, R, and K spells to break open, the egg. C, L, and S is slick, is action, is motion. D, M, and T, there's no really good one. I'm using demote as the sense of dilution. And N, E, and K means the neck, is a nexus, is an internal middle connector, bringing things together. Now, we know, we did this first half of the chart, so we know what's going to happen coming up the other side of the arc. If Gimel, Lamed, and Shin are action between limits, then Zion, Ayin, then Vav, Samech, and final Mem must be another kind of I'm sorry, I skipped one. They have to be like DM and T. I don't want to get confused. If DM and T are this division, then Vav, Mem, and final Mem, Vav, Samech, and final Mem must be multiplication. In fact, these are the letters that correspond to the golden mean functions. The Vav corresponds to the lost digamma in Greek, which was replaced by the letter Phi, which is used to designate the golden mean. And the letter Vav, the name Vav, means a pin. It means and in Hebrew. And so the idea of multiplication is and, and and, and and, and and. And Vav, spelled FF, is our word fife, vibration. It's that kind of vein. It's doing this. It's the O in the word do. It's that oo when it has a vowel sound of oo in Hebrew. The Samech we don't have in English, but if the Vav is the golden mean, then the Samech is the inverse golden mean, and the final Mem, which is a square-shaped Samech, is the golden mean squared. Samech is an interesting letter. Samech in Hebrew means to sustain or support. It's spelled this not really an S, but this Samech letter, then Mem, and then this final K. Well, that's our word smoke. And the smoke ring is the lowest order form that self-sustains in a uniform, homogeneous, cosmic jello. It is the fundamental support to this reality. This is Samech. Well, it also looks like this. It's a circular letter. The final Mem is the same meaning as the medial Mem. It's the C, but in this case it's the external C. It's the hierarchy of wave motion. Instead of being the womb, it's the external hierarchy. It's got a masculine connotation. It's self-reference acting on itself, generation on generation. Okay, now we go to the next one. Zion, ayin, final nun, G, O, and the final N. You can't see it too well because I used too dark a marker. Now this is a more beautiful example. The word Zion in Hebrew, which should be over here, literally means a weapon or an axe. But A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Oh, it's a Russian G. That's why it's got the Z sound to it. So if it's a G and not a Z, then the word is G, a vowel and an N. And we know that as gain or gun, or go on. So it's called a weapon or an axe in Hebrew, but it has the same meaning in English. Most extraordinary. The ayin in Hebrew, ayin means just what it sounds like. It means an eye or a well. And in fact, the cognate is I, own, or this internal possession, to go deeply inward. You see, if Zion is a gun, is projecting outward, then ayin is projecting inward. And the final N, just like we had a medial N was a neck or nexus, what does an N at the end of a word mean? In English, in mathematics, we say take something to the nth degree. It means to go on out forever, to continue on out. So the Zion is to project, the ayin is to project in, and the final nun is to project out, to extrapolate. Let's go one more. Let's do H, P, and final P. Well, this letter, this chet, in Hebrew, looks just like the Greek letter pi. And in fact, the Hebrew meaning of the word chet means a fenced field or a perimeter, which is sort of what pi is about. Chet is spelled H-E-T, or H a vowel T. That's our word hat or hut, something that surrounds you, a fenced field, a circumference. P in Hebrew, the letter Pe, is in the same position in the alphabet as the Greek pi, and it does refer to the same kind of pi-ish function, except P is to engulf, to swallow, to bring in. So it's a volume taken inward. And the final P, same meaning, is the volume pushed outward, to puff outward. And if we take them together, I didn't do the three together for the G, O, and N. Well, G, O, and N mean to go on, which is just what this projective idea is. This is H and whatever the vowel might be and a couple of P's. Well, that's a hoop, which is this surrounding idea, this pi-ish idea. Now, finally, if this was unity, then this is going to be wholeness. So the tet, which is equivalent to our J, a jet, a tit, goes beyond this completion. If this is individuation, this is breaking open, then this is ego, this is individuation. Then beyond being born, beyond being individuated, there is a gratuitous function that finishes the cycle. That is when a parent gives a tit to a child to suckle, or the child is suckled. The child will survive if it's not suckled, but it's not complete. And so tet means completion. Jet, tide, total are the same words in English. The tzadi is an interesting word. If the tet, if the J is the idea of completeness, then tzadi must be spiritual completeness. Well, the word tzadi in Hebrew means a righteous person, a tzadi. It corresponds to our sort of English word zodiac. But that ts sound can also be an ST. And if we have ST, a vowel, a D, and an I, which is how you spell the letter tzadi, the name of the letter, then that's the word study. Which is, of course, to stand upright, to be complete inside. That's the studied person. It also relates to justice. The final tzadi, if this is a righteous person, is an upright person, then this one must be upright in the physical world. And so this one is Eitz, the tree. Now, what do we have? We have a completely logical system based on the term, embedded in the Enneagram, because after all, if we take the 7 stages of process and we embed them between unity and wholeness, we have an Enneagram. We have an Enneagram, do we? Oh, well, wait a minute. That's what we have over here, isn't it? 3 levels of 9 in a logical matrix unfurling from very simple principles, hierarchically, 3 levels: a archetypal level, an intermediate level, and a physical, an external level. The same as the 3 levels here. Why do there have to be 3 levels? Because inside, outside, and in between is what defines the solidity of the twister. You see, if it didn't have 3 levels, it wouldn't be a hypersphere. It would be incomplete. That's the only way we can project it. Every cycle has to have 3 points on it. If I were to have 2 flashing lights, you couldn't tell this was a circle. But if I had 3 lights flashing in sequence, you could tell this was a circle. It takes 3 counts to define rotation, the circulation. And that's why we have a matrix that is 3 by 3 by 3. Here is another version in the form of an apple or a torus, closer to the Penrose twister, closer to the torus. The same principle. These are just alternate drawings. The little sketches are to give you some sort of schematic idea of what the words mean. But the words could be any other set of words that have the same topological relationship to each other. They have to form a complete and diagonal cycle with the 7 stages of process embedded within them in 3 levels. Now, I gave you some examples of words. I want to give you a few more, and then I have some list of words, plus, in case people are interested, this is a totally independent work showing that there are actually Hebrew roots to English words, and pointing out that the reason we think there was an Indo-European language group is because of political considerations by Northern Europeans a couple of hundred years ago, when it was politically impolite to attribute European words to Semitic or African roots. And so they created, according to this fellow, for political and religious reasons, a Indo-European language group theory. In fact, the original dictionaries written in the United States used Semitic and African roots, the original Webster dictionaries. And they only switched over to the so-called Indo-European, Latin, etc. stuff after the, what was it called, the high tradition of scholarship in Northern Europe. Well, the word for letter in Hebrew is a nice word. I like that word. It's spelled A-F-T, pronounced ought. Look what it says. I'm saying the letters come from this form of naked recursion. Aleph is all consciousness. Vav is the idea of doing or unfurling or vibrating. And Tav is acting on itself in its own image. So ought means consciousness unfurling itself in its own likeness. I'd say that's about the same meaning as naked recursion. So the transformation between the forms, which I didn't get to before, which is all new material. And I didn't get to talk about some of these other figures either. This figure, called the Schlafly double 6, represents some of these 27 lines projected back into 3 dimensions. You have 12 of them. As you can see, it has this unique pattern to it, which is very much like the Tajin pattern that I was talking about earlier, that corresponds to the little decorations that are on the letters. Some of the letters have these decorations on them, and those turn out to be these corner pieces. This same form turns out to sit, as Fuller shows, around an icosahedral ball in an cuboctahedral shell. And so we can make this 27-line form using the cuboctahedron. This is actually only 12 of the Schlafly double 6 form. And this has some interesting properties. You see, these skew lines ought to be the sighting directions for the letters, physically. Now, if you take this guy and you connect this point to this, and this point to this, and this point to this, to make it into a donut, by curling it around on itself, this is what you get. This is the second lowest order knot that you can make, the 3/4 knot. And even though it's not obvious, this form is the same as this form. Here it is flat. In fact, you can see it. Here's another version. These are topologically identical, all of these. And so these distinctions in knot theory form the same structure. But here we have the 22 letters forming the core, if I can get it up in there. And then, if we would extend the letters that become finals out onto the rim, above and below, then we have the 27-letter form. You see, the 27 is on the spherical form, and the 22 is on the linear form. This is like the relationship in superstring space, and this is like the event. The 27 is like the event. So there's a direct transform on all of these knots. In fact, let me show it to you. This is the 3/4 knot. All I have to do to make it into the trifolium is to pull it out. And there's my trefoil form, which is up on the walls and has a tetrahelix in the middle of it. It's just topology. It does it to itself. There's no need to do anything. By the way, you cannot make a tetrahedron out of it. It is not symmetrical. It has to be a double figure to do that, which explains some of it. And I want to fit this in too. There is a motion that unfurls all of these. If one moves according to these orbits, then one produces the form. If you have a central point, okay, and you do this, the point explodes in 3 directions and pulls apart and twists simultaneously. Comes up like this Tai Chi Aikido type motion. Here's what you get. These edges coming up out of this tetrahedral shell, out of this icosahedron in the middle, because that's what's in the middle, this is 3 intersections, see the center? These 3 edges turn out to be, if you start with a hypertetrahedron in the middle, the same as these rubber bands. And it comes right up into the 27 line figure. Okay. Now, I think that it is a good idea to take a break. There are a lot of questions that people can ask. I really haven't covered all the details. What I wanted to do was get the matrix of meaning for the alphabet out. There is one more thing that I want to share with you, and that is how does one connect these letter shapes with the 27 directions, but we'll leave that for after the stretch. Also for after the stretch, I want to deal with questions and with word examples. Now, I've got a whole bunch of examples that I brought, plus you can throw some at me. I don't know how well I'll do. It only works about 80% of the time, because there's lots of reasons why this is an imprecise art. But I think we should discuss some of the implications of this. So, stretch time. Traditionally, of course, this nice shape is the same shape as the ram's horn, which is said to have been created during the creation of the universe. And so when people say, well, how come your letters look like these rabbinic hands, that these rabbis have your model on the table? No, they didn't have my model on the table. They had our chauffeur on the table. So they could easily have made the letters. There's, people wanted to see what the letters really look like. So let me tell you that you can see the letters on either hand. For instance, from my point of view now, I can see 2 letter M's in Hebrew. Both of these are M's. And guess what? What if we were to draw a line between these 2 M's? We would have a direction. And there, of course, be 27 of them. So it may be very easy to make the 27 correlation simply by lighting up the 2 ends of the line. Here are 2 ends. Also, another thing that's interesting, you've all heard about the Akbash code, which is a front-back reflection code that was used in the Kabbalistic tradition. A is T, and B is S, and C is R. Well, that's how the letters pair up. You see, when I hold the letters like this, in my left hand I see the letter A, and in my right hand I see the letter T. If I hold my hands like this, in my left hand I see the letter S, and in my right hand I see the letter B. And so the front and back of the alphabet are mirror images of each other. Now, I do... Huh? Yeah, this could be a natural hand language. In fact, what I'm proposing is that this is the ideal language for hearing impaired people, because it could be learned immediately by people who can hear. Everybody can visualize their own hands, and these gestures have intrinsic meaning. That's why there are mudras and asanas in the Eastern traditions, because those gestures bring up particular feelings. Also, I wanted to point out that everything that I can do with my self-referential hand, my thumb to my hand, I can also do with my hand to my arm to my body. And just like there are 12 around 1 for this 13-petaled rose fruit, there are also, not counting the jaw, or actually counting the jaw, 12 joints in the body from the tip of my finger to the tip of my toe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so we are 13-petaled roses, just as the introduction to the Zohar says, and mapping our body onto our mind. Our body is mapped on the motor cortex of our mind, is the same as mapping the, where is it? The fruit tree onto the fruit. See, we are just like the fruit. Mapped on our minds, on our seed, on our fruit, if you will, is our body, is our life cycle. That's how we control ourselves. So the embryonic metaphor for vegetable world fits in our world too. I want to read something. We started with the first verse of Genesis, but now we have individual translations for each of the letters. So I could now read this first verse of Genesis off of the alphabet charts. What do you suppose it would say? Let me read it. You tell me what you think it says. Now, I could be using other words, and I'm picking these words off of the chart selectively, but I'm always using the same words for the same letter, so it makes it a little redundant. But listen to this. This is what's translated in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. In Hebrew, it's Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Breaking open, inside, outside, rushing, radiating, reaching, all life, shining, source light, in inner being, itself recurring, in itself. Breaking open, inside, outside, rushing, radiating, reaching, all life. All life, blooming, kindling, inside lighting, looking open, in without, in inner being, golden flowing, moving outward, in itself. All life itself recurring in itself, looking open, in without, shining source light, inside dividing, in inner being, golden flowing, moving outward, in itself. Doing, living, co-evolving, all life itself recurring in itself, looking open, in without, all life rushing, radiating, reaching, treetops upright, bearing wholeness, carrying light. Now, if you take away the poetic level, which I like anyway, and you could do it a lot of different variations, this is a continuous spiraling system. In fact, if you look at it carefully, it is literally describing these 3 layers. And so the text of the first verse, which geometrically folds itself up into the form that makes the letters, also describes the way you scan the form to see the letters. We're talking about self-embedded here, par excellence. This is naked recursion. Okay, now let's go, so some questions, and then I'll intersperse them with some examples of words. And I want to start off with a word that I've always liked myself, and it's the word that is obviously attributed to the Latin. Everyone knows where albino comes from, right? Albino, L-B-N. Okay, in Hebrew, there is a word that means white, and it's Levana, L-B-N. You would never expect that. Okay, now, questions? I saw some around here.
When you try to imagine that you're a Chinese here in the audience listening to Stan Tenen say that somehow it is the Hebrew alphabet that has managed to capture within itself the various dimensions of reality.
Well, I would say I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the reason why the Hebrew alphabet is what it is because it's reflecting a natural property of the world, of reality. After all, it doesn't matter which tradition claims pi as its own. Pi is intrinsic to the world. This way of making letters and language is intrinsic to the way our consciousness is organized. It is embodied in different cultures and traditions in very many different ways, but the fundamental topology is the same. What the Hebrew is preserved is that topology in its essence, unadorned. whereas other traditions haven't necessarily. We have, the Genesis text is the oldest intact record. That's the only priority.
I would imagine, therefore, that you would be very much interested in listening to this kind of an analysis by your opposite part among the Orientalists.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, in this book, this is really strange, but I don't know how legitimate it is. This is, as I said, it's completely independent work. I haven't met the fellow, although we ought to get connected. He points out, he gives an example here, although he doesn't give an attribution of, that's the one page I can't get to open, here it goes. He's got a little alphabet chart here, and he shows Hebrew alphabet, and he shows a bunch of alphabets that people think are related, like Greek and English, and then he shows what he calls Old Japanese. And some of the letters are readable, as the same as they are in Hebrew or Greek. And the reason is because they come from these archetypal shapes, I think. Now, I haven't checked this, but it's not. Others have proposed that there is a connection. And also, here's a connection too. If you look through the 7 principal symmetries of the tetrahedron, I know the model's here. Here it is. Along these 7 axes. There's 7 independent axes, 10 tips. Then what you're going to see, if you pair up the flame shapes, are these 7 yogic postures. It's the body language that was preserved in Eastern traditions. I'm not talking Chinese here, but Eastern traditions, whereas the legal text, the written language, is preserved in the West. That's why I'm making a connection between the Abrahamic and the Brahmic traditions. I think they come from a common source, and it's a matter of cultural claims which one has priority. I don't want to do that.
If I could just add something. You mentioned Chinese, perhaps at random, but when you were talking about the tortoise, it was making connections because there's I don't remember the details, but a source of origin for, I think it was the hexagram pattern of the I Ching, of some philosopher, I don't know his name, was staring at a tortoise shell and saw them.
And the turtle pattern holding up the world comes both from the East and from the Amerindian traditions, both, which is very surprising because now we just found out it comes from the Semitic traditions too.
So when you're talking about Genesis being the oldest text, and a couple of years ago when I heard your lecture, you were talking about how the first work that you were doing was on the first part of Genesis, and that was obviously the first Genesis story, and you said that there was embedded systems in other parts of the Bible, but you didn't get into it at the time. My question has to do with the first and the second Genesis stories, and the obvious allusion to the many, or the Elohim, in the first creation story, and the Yahweh in the second creation story, and does that have any relevance to your work?
Well, it probably does, but I'm not looking at the word meanings because they're too controversial. I'm not an expert in it, and there's so much nonsense that's been said. It's just another voice screaming into the surf. My feeling is that we should read the text letter by letter as we learn the definition of the letters and let the text tell us what's going on rather than impose these theories on it, which we could argue for all the time. I think now that what's happening is, let me say it, I think that if we get this right, if we can figure out what this natural unfoldment is, and we keep track of it in the way that was intended, which is going to be the most compact and economical way, we are going to be able to show that the sequence of letters in the text of Genesis is just as determined as the sequence of digits in the decimal expansion for pi. That is a natural artifact of this universe at the level. In fact, that quality is very similar to pi. After all, the text, you're not supposed to change a letter to be the destruction of the universe. If you changed any digit in pi, it wouldn't be pi. Same kind of thing. Who wrote pi? Did God write pi or man write pi? There are statisticians who've shown that there are letter-level patterns throughout the books of Moses. The observant people, the religious people, say, well, that proves only God could have done it. Because how could you write these intense, deeply, convoluted mathematical patterns and still have it read like text? And the Bible scholars who don't believe anything said, oh, that proves that it can't have come from God, that man had to have made it up like a double-crossed it. Ezra sat there and worked out all these patterns. And they both are using the same evidence to prove the opposite. But I'm saying they're both missing the point. That pi is not written by God or man alone. Pi is determined by God, by nature, by reality. but it's written in our number system for our benefit. The pattern in the Bible, in the Torah, is a pattern of creation, not because some religious fanatic said so, but because, like pi, it is demonstrable from this reality and co-generates this reality. So that we ought to be able to unfurl the sequence of letters. Here's another way. Here's another problem. People have said that the 5 books of Moses can't have all been sacred, can't have all come from God, because they were written supposedly over 1,000 years. So how could these patterns go from one text to the other unless someone redacted them all together? But everyone knows, and I'm not good at this, if you're doing something in Tai Chi, or if you're swinging a golf club, you have to follow through. If you're in a deep meditation, and you're following through a sequence of feelings leading towards this brilliant point of transcendence, then there is only one path, there is only one follow-through. And to continue to unfurl the text, as a prophet might be able to, means merely to stay on balance on that line, to ride the surfboard ashore. You don't have to do anything but stand upright on the surfboard. In fact, standing upright on the surfboard is a very good analogy for all of this, because in Talmud there is a phrase used to designate a person of integrity. They were called tofo kavara. That means that their outside is just like their inside. But if you can make your outside like your inside, these are inversions to each other. Bringing your outside and inside together is symbolically self-abnegation. That's the meditation. That's the loss loss of ego in the meditation. That's why this is also Aladdin's lamp. Aladdin, the judgment of God. If you meditate, if you rub this thing, if you feel it, it forms in your mind's eye. In the meditation, you can manifest things if you want to. I don't know if you want to use your ego there, but that's where reality becomes flexible. So this understanding of an alphabet that connects inside and outside, as Nick Herbert says, one of the greatest scientific achievements imaginable would be the discovery of an explicit relationship between the waveform alphabets of quantum theory and certain human states of consciousness. If we can bring inside and outside together, then that's a self-abnegation of reality. We're all in an egoless state. That's why this is a prophetic and messianic teaching, if it comes to that. Those kind of words, but it means changing the world. It means tinkering with the roots of consciousness. Okay?
I do a lot of yoga, so I was wondering how you evolved that particular set of yogic designs.
Purely from the man. All I did was let Occam shave himself. Look, that's what the text says. Here's a string of letters that folds up into a form that makes the letters that the text is written in. And the string of letters also specifies how you walk around the form to make the letters. Occam is shaving himself. There ain't no Occam there. There ain't no razor. It's just Occam. It's just self-reference. It's just Ein Sof. It's just cosmic jello falling through itself, and wherever it results. I should go to the site.
Is there any argument that Hebrew isn't the foundation of all languages? Is that what I'm picking up?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
In fact, what I'm saying is that, well, my feeling is that this is intrinsic to consciousness. And so, in some sense, this language was created with the creation of the universe. And therefore, all living things at all levels and all times have partaken of it. But in our historical stream, whatever reality that has, because who knows, the tradition that has preserved the material intact, that is the oldest, is the one that comes with the Old Testament, with the 5 books of Moses. There are others who have obviously picked up on it. In Islamic Spain, the Muslims, the Christians, and the Jews had a lovely time together for a while, till the Inquisition showed up. And they shared all of this knowledge. And they re-elaborated what the Greeks, I mean, there are references that say that Pythagoras studied with the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin studied the Pythagorean material, because they have to know the secular world also. And so these high traditions knew each other, knew of each other. This was what I think we've got here is a fundamental worldview of the ancient world, but kept in its pure form, in its survivable, intact form in the scripture that's come down to us.
we can relate that to Canaan and back to Sumer. I thought that's already been proven. I mean, Hebrew is the oldest dialect of Canaan.
All right, there's a difference between knowing this technically and understanding its depth. The Greeks Hellenized, supposedly, this material into an external embodiment. And so instead of recognizing, as Rabbi Shimon in the Zohar says, that these geometries are an aid to meditation, they started to make idols. Shiny, metallic things that you could use as totems. You know, look at all the magic we can do with this. Oh, I was doing a magic trick before. Whoa, look, very mysterious, watch. See, they're hooked together. Yeah, I mean, here, there are so many cheap magic tricks one can do if one has a little consciousness edge on the population, that these ideas can be easily abused and externalized. These are not things. These are relationships. This is topology. It's not stuff. If you take it as stuff, you're making pagan idols. And while the Sumerians might have known the math, they didn't have the Abrahamic tradition that inside and outside was one.